I want to welcome you all here tonight for our event within the framework of the Kyiv Biennial School of Abandoned Europe, Abducted Europe, apologies. I've been saying it for 2 months and still get it wrong. So we are delighted to welcome you for this event entitled The Refugee Crisis and Its Implications for Ukraine. We are joined today by 3 panelists for whom we're very thankful that they've accepted our invitation. First to my left here is Ангеліна Карякіна, who studied German at the Taras Shevchenko University and then worked as a correspondent and editor in print media in Ukraine. Since 2015, she's been with Громадське TV. She's covered the Sentsov and Kolchenko trial, as well as has traveled to the Hungarian-Serbian border to write on the refugee crisis. Next to her is Yenn Epplbaum, a columnist for the Washington Post and Slate, who also directs the Transitions Forum at the Legatum Institute in London. Among her writings include 2 books, most recently Iron Curtain, about Eastern Europe after the Second World War, and Gulag: A History, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2004. Her work has been published in leading magazines and newspapers in the US, UK, Poland, Germany, and many other places. And then finally is Maksym Butkevich, who is co-founder and co-coordinator of No Borders at the Social Action Center NGO. He's been working for many years on issues of asylum, refugees, internally displaced persons, xenophobia, racism. He has been on the national board of Amnesty International in Ukraine and has collaborated with the UNHCR. He has also worked as a journalist both in Ukraine and internationally. So thank you very much to all 3 of you for joining us this evening. I'm going to turn the floor over to you now and let Angelina take it away.
Oh, I'm shouting.
Okay. I think we're shouting for now.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you for inviting me over, and I'm really honored to be in such a distinguished panel. As Kate already mentioned, I recently came back from the Hungarian-Serbian border. This is where we tried to cover just a piece of this massive and huge crisis, and where we had a chance to see just several little stories, but they were telling us more and giving a whole picture. You could see the whole picture just from there, from the little town of Rozke, which is just on the border between Serbia and Hungary. So I wanted to talk about 2 main things that struck me, and this one is one of the... Oh, okay, we have a voice now.
So I wanted to talk about 2 things which really struck me working in the field, and the other thing is when I came back here to Ukraine, what kind of a reaction and a feedback I got from the reports and from the work that I brought here. So the first thing that we saw when we came to Rozke is a complete mess. Just thousands of people in camps, no food, almost no water, no clothes, only hundreds of volunteers and international organizations just bringing stuff over just to help. Anything they can, anything that comes on their mind. They were bringing different kinds of fruits, and I was witnessing a conflict between a representative of a well-known world international organization and just a volunteer explaining that you cannot give grapes to thousands of people because it may end up with with problems in a camp, that if they want fruits, you should bring apples, for example. This was one of the conflicts. So people were just improvising, and even though this crisis was taking pretty long time and people were crossing this border for weeks, this whole situation just seemed to be out of control. The Hungarian authorities seemed not to care at all. And it took sometimes up to 10 hours to put people on a bus and take them to Budapest and then to the Austrian border. But in one night, it was the last night before Hungary closed down its border, we found ourselves in an absolutely empty camp. They managed to put 3,000 people into the buses within just 3 hours. So it proved that if somebody has a plan, if somebody knows what to do, it could be managed just in several hours. Of course, we brought dozens and hundreds of stories of people telling us how, how they got to Hungary. All of those stories you probably heard, you probably watched, you probably saw those terrifying pictures. So I don't think it's necessary to focus on that. The most important thing is that when I came back to Ukraine, and when I was there, I was sending videos and sending photos. The first question I got from my fellow colleague was, what are those kids, like hundreds of kids you were showing? Couldn't you show anything else? Like there were only kids? Are you trying to squeeze a tear out of us? Like we all need to feel bad about this? This was the first question I got from my Ukrainian colleague. And I was really surprised, and I didn't know what to say, because actually hundreds and thousands of kids, it was actually the thing that I saw there and that struck me there. They were all around the place, they were helpless, and if I even wanted to show something else, it was impossible, because they were running all around with their parents or without their parents, so it was impossible, to pick up a different picture and to show, I don't know what he was expecting to see, my colleague, but this was the first thing. Then dozens and hundreds of questions followed from other people here in Ukraine, from my friends, from my family, and those questions were, they were not about who are those people, where are they coming. The question was, why are they headed to Germany? Why don't they stay in Serbia, for example? Why don't they stay in Greece or any country they cross first? This was also a very interesting question, and when you would start this conversation, you wouldn't hear fears or concerns about security, for example. You would hear this resentment and a huge I would call it resentment, that with this influx of Arabs, we will lose Europe. We won't ever see beautiful middle-aged Europe, which we probably keep in our minds as the majority Ukrainians do. So, of course, these questions and this reaction, it explains a lot about how this crisis is taken here in Ukraine, and how this crisis is also covered here in Ukraine. There was an interesting article, if I'm not mistaken, in New York Times by Ivan Krastev, on how incurious and insular Eastern Europe is, and I would totally agree that Ukraine is also on the list, taking very small interest in what is happening in the world. This is why sometimes there is no understanding who are actually Syrians, who are actually Arabs, what is the difference between Iraq and Iran, and some people even don't know that there is no war in Iran. They don't distinguish. This is why there are lots of things to tell about those countries and to tell and to understand about this crisis. And it's a hard job to do, because working on international affairs, we still see that there is very small interest in what is happening in the world. And maybe I should turn this microphone to Anne. And my question would be first, how do you think this crisis may change? I mean, there was a lot of discussion that this crisis is bringing back the division between East and West. That there is a certain reaction from Eastern European countries and Western European countries. There were lots of discussions on, let's say, lack of solidarity in Eastern European countries. First question is, do you agree with that? And secondly, do you think this also brings Ukraine on the list of these Eastern European countries with all the consequences that may follow?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and I'm really delighted to be here in Kyiv, and delighted to be here at Krytyka Polityczna, an organization I know very well from Warsaw, which I think is your sister organization. So I'm going to slightly play devil's advocate. So you have given a very, the very honest view of what it looks like on the ground, and I know very well, because of friends of friends, the terrible situation of people in Syria and how very desperate people get to leave, and well, I understand very well why they're leaving. I will try and explain, though, what it looks like, why it's become such a difficult political issue. So this is the non-emotional, non-human interest piece of the story. And first of all, this question about dividing Europe is an important one, partly because I think it's not true, in that I think this is an issue that divides every single European country. It's not an East-West division. One of the things that's happening now in Germany is after Merkel made this big gesture and said, we'll take up to 800,000 immigrants, there's begun to be a backlash. And she, for the first time, her popularity is falling. She's beginning to be criticized by other political parties. There's a feeling in Germany that, we don't know where this is going to end. Maybe it's too much. And there's a similar reaction. I mean, it's happening in other European countries. It's happening in the Netherlands, which, and in a number of other places. So what Eastern Europe did, what this Visegrad group did, was make a joint statement at the beginning, which if they'd understood better, well, I think they have ulterior motives, but they made a joint statement at the beginning saying, we don't understand what's going on. We don't think this plan is going to work. And what's happening now is that other people are beginning to say it all over Europe in a slightly different way. The part of the problem with what Merkel did, and I admire her profoundly, and I understand why she did it. She has she's an East German background. She has a memory of what it's like to be a refugee. She knows people who were refugees. We all forget now that Germany was really a nation of refugees not that long ago, 60 years ago, and so there's an enormous amount of sympathy. But what she did do was, by saying, everybody can come to Germany, she broke the rules that the EU had created about accepting refugees. So the EU did have a rule. There was supposed to be a way to deal with it. The first country that refugees come to is the one they're supposed to stay in. Then their applications for asylum are supposed to be examined, and then after that they're supposed to be let in or sent back, And this was the system. And what she did, without really consulting anybody, was break the system. She said, no, I'm not, it's a crisis, I'm going to take people in. And as I said, I empathize with her, I understand why she did it. But she did change the rules, and this is part of what's left people uncomfortable, is that, okay, so what are the rules? And the reason why there are all these questions about the legitimacy of the refugees is because, is everybody on the boat somebody who, if we examine their application, is it somebody we would have let in, or are they economic refugees, or who are they? So that's one set of problems. The second set of problems is in almost every single European country, including East European countries, including France, very much including France, including the Netherlands, there are now political parties which are organized around, manipulating and using xenophobic and anti-foreigner and especially anti-Islamic rhetoric. And so almost every mainstream leader in Europe has an opposition party like that. Even as I said, countries you don't think of, like the Netherlands, has a very strong one. France obviously has Marine Le Pen. Britain has UKIP. There are, so it's to a greater or lesser degree, these are very, none of them, other than in Hungary, where Jobbik is, I can't remember, I think it's about 20% now. They don't have majorities anywhere, but they're big and important opposition parties, also in Scandinavia. And so for sort of mainstream European leaders, this is also a problem. And some of them, I noticed that the Danes, the Dutch and others have been very, very quiet throughout this crisis, because all of those countries, they're led by, either center-left or center-right people, but they are very aware of their sort of far-right or sort of anti-immigrant political opponents. So this is a very delicate issue that can really divide all of Europe. And Eastern Europe, I think, this Visegrad group handled it rather badly, but they were saying things that you could hear in other capitals. I think it's a mistake to think it's an East-West divide. Another point that's important to understand is that it's also an issue that's being used by people. So if Merkel made mistakes, I think what you saw on the border of Hungary was, Orban has been using this issue actually for months, manipulating it, increasing it. As you probably know, that he put signs up all over Hungary, warning refugees to go to camps. You're not allowed to wander around the country. And of course, the signs were in Hungarian, and I didn't think anybody who coming into Hungary speaks Hungarian, because nobody speaks Hungarian, except for about 10 people in Uzhgorod. He's been using this issue as a way of showing I'm tough on refugees. And again, for him, it's also a political issue against Jobbik, which is the far-right party in Hungary. And I think what you saw when you were there, this sudden sense of crisis that was created in Hungary, I think was deliberate. He deliberately created a crisis. He created a crisis at the train station. He stopped letting people get on the trains. That was all theater. That was in order to show that I'm Orban and I'm doing something strong, and standing up to, these mushy left-wing people in Europe, and I'm doing, so that was but what he did is exactly what others could do in other countries. And that's why, for example, David Cameron in Britain, has been also hasn't said very much, and what he's said generally is we will take more refugees, but we'll take them from Syria, or from Turkey. So we don't want to discourage people because there's a feeling in Britain and many other countries that what Merkel did by breaking the rules, she created an incentive for more people to come. And so that's what's there's now a situation that's unclear, and that's really the political problem in Europe, because that's how we now have a situation where people who dislike Europe or want to weaken Europe, like and institutions of Europe, like Orban, now have a kind of stick to beat Merkel with, or the Germans with, and there's now by dealing with this as a crisis, as a not thought through all the consequences of what she was going to do, which is very unlike her, I should say. I think she's extended the crisis. The final thing I would say is that the fact that it was even though, as we know, this has been going on for months. We were hearing about the boats across the Mediterranean 8 months ago. It's not like this is a new story. And the fact that Europe hadn't found a way to deal with it and hadn't found a solution, I think is indicative of a deeper problem, which is that Europe was never set up, well, I should say it differently. In theory, Europe has the institutions to have a kind of foreign and security policy. It's supposed to be thinking about, making peace in Syria, and it's supposed to have EU diplomats who are able to come up with solutions. But actually, in practice, none of that works very well. The bits of the EU that sort of do work are often the economic bits, the people that have been really invested in. Although that also not so much recently, but it's never the EU the institution, the people who are meant to be thinking about this. Either don't do it, or they don't have the power to do it, or they've been restricted by the bigger states in the EU, which don't want it to have a foreign policy. So that was a much longer answer than probably you wanted. So sorry.
No, it's absolutely, it's great. Thank you so much. But I have just another follow-up. Getting back again to the reaction on the crisis, it's obvious that no one was ready, or no one was ready to come up with a strategy on that, how to fight that, or how to handle it. But still, do you think is there a reason why Visegrad countries, or so to say Eastern European countries, reacted in such a way? Because they actually had, and they're having quite a joint position on opposing policy of quotas, or they still have this joint position on a number of questions, and it's a different position. Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Yes, Poland did drop out, but the others have. Yeah. They've said it. I think because. First of all, I think the politics in those countries is less sophisticated, and they don't have this. I don't know. I'm not sure what exactly the right words is, but as I said, the Dutch and the Danish have been very quiet about this, although I'm sure they also oppose quotas. But they don't talk about it. So they were less sophisticated about making their wishes known. There's another thing, that's true about Central Europe, is that the Central Europeans have no actually, all of them have a tradition of taking refugees. Many of them have taken refugees, particularly during the Bosnian War. Even Hungary took quite a lot of refugees during the Bosnian War. But they don't have any tradition of having Muslim inhabitants. They don't have Islam at all in their countries. And so there's a I'm speaking I live part of the time in Poland, and it's true that there is a sense of, that Muslim problem, that's one they have in Western Europe, and we don't want to have it here. We've avoided, that's one bullet we dodged in the 20th century. We don't have that issue, and we don't want it. And so I think there is that, you're probably right, there is that extra edge. Nevertheless, I would say that there would be a lot of people in France and a lot of people in Britain who would say the same, who would say, we have that problem, we don't want it to be greater. And the problem, again, isn't, the problem is that it's the fear of terrorism, it's the fear of what happened in Paris, I don't think it's entirely racism, although there's a touch of that too.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting also how is it called? On the one hand, some call it xenophobia, and the others tend to call it racism. So it's also interesting.
I'm happy to use either word.
Okay.
Yeah.
If we get back to Ukraine with Maksym here. Have you mentioned this kind of? Have you noticed this kind of resentment over losing Europe, which we never had here among Ukrainians? And what kind of? Where do you think this crisis puts Ukraine right now?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you. I had already very interesting minutes listening, because the issue or number of issues tied together are so complicated. They show things and show issues which of them deserves a special event or series of events. For Ukraine, I would say, from my perspective, where I stand, Ukraine is in a very special and interesting position, because we are able to look from the outside at what happens now in Europe with refugees from the Middle East, from Syria and other neighboring countries, without dealing with the issues ourselves as a country. And we are also not part of the EU, despite all the years of political process in this direction. On the other hand, yes, starting with the direct response to your question, I'm afraid it's not only that I've heard the resentment and fear concerning losing Europe. I had a very unpleasant but quite typical for many of us situation when I had a very tough discussion in this direction with my closest family members, who know for years what I do and who know personally some of the refugees we assisted together here in Ukraine, and who are not racist or xenophobes. But at a certain moment in our discussion, in our conversation, suddenly one of them, my beloved relative, suddenly said, you know what, all these dark-skinned people of different faith with totally different traditions and customs who come around to enjoy the comfort of Europe we've built, and and that was a moment of sad truth for me. I said, oh, Maksym, how can you talk to wider audiences about these issues when you cannot actually talk about them to your family members? You cannot convince them or explain them something, which is, of course, a paradox, because point number one, very obvious to any person who dares to think about it. We think about our Europe when we think about Germany or France or Hungary. But of course, we are not perceived as being part of this Europe in those countries themselves. And anyone who lived in the EU countries, being from, for instance, from Ukraine, knows very well how Ukrainians are not different to people from more distant countries, because they're outsiders who came to live on our benefits and steal our jobs, and they're of different traditions and customs, etc., etc. Second, of course, Europe is our Europe when it comes to Ukraine, as well as many other countries are. When we use words like refugee crisis, well, Ukrainians have experience of refugee crisis. It's most of the 20th century, but this is crisis of Ukrainians being forced to go abroad. Look what happened between the two world wars to Ukrainians and many other persons and peoples from former Russian Empire and neighboring states. This was real flood of refugees, not what we witness now. What we witness now is a kindergarten comparing to what existed there. Without system in place of asylum, nonsense passport was basically pushed through and invented in the context of that crisis. Without social support, with terrible and extremely dangerous political processes in Europe, of course, concentrating mostly in Stalin's Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Well, I mean, anyone who read Remarks books on refugees in Europe at the time know, even from the bell letter, what it means. So that was a crisis. Hungarians remember very well refugee crisis as well in 1956. When they had to flee en masse in huge numbers, speaking Hungarian, to neighboring countries. Somehow no one really understood them, but they were accepted. What is interesting, we see that neither for Hungary, nor for Ukraine, nor for other countries in our region, this historical memory doesn't really play any role in discussion which goes on around the contemporary situation. It's like these are two totally separate matters. It's like that past never existed or existed in a different world, which is not the case, of course. And, well, I think, Angelina, you should stop me at some point because there are so many issues. What I would just dare to mention shortly two things. One is already mentioned by Angelina, so I will just make an emphasis on that. To me, there is a crisis, definitely, refugee crisis in Europe, and this is a bit separate matter, but it's not crisis in terms of numbers of people who seek asylum. It's regarding the challenges towards the system constructed by the EU when it comes to controlling undesirable immigration, undesirable in, brackets. But the problem is that security was for years the priority, well, compared to humanitarian issues and asylum. And I'm afraid that the EU now has to deal with this. But what we see, the reaction is different from what can be expected. There is a crisis to me in media, specifically Ukrainian ones. Not crisis portrayed by media, but this became a challenge to media as an environment, as a profession, to standards of journalism, and unfortunately we see that some of the publications and some of the articles didn't really stand up to the challenge. They could not provide sufficient amount of information for their audience, respective audiences, to make informed critical decision. They provided cliches and many of them provided blunt fears and nothing else. And this is a very sad story. And third point, when we talk about refugee crisis, I think in Ukraine we have asylum crisis. I'm not talking about IDPs now. I'm talking about international asylum system. We have asylum crisis because, as a matter of fact, we don't have proper asylum. No asylum, but there are still people who need this asylum, who apply for asylum, and who stand very little chance of getting it. It's an old phenomena, very well known to anyone who deals with asylum. If your country is destination country for refugees, it means you are doing more or less well. Ukraine is not a destination country. No one wants to come to live in Ukraine, to contribute to Ukrainian economy, to integrate, to become part of Ukrainian society, even if Ukraine is actually a bit more diverse than some of its neighbors. For instance, Islam as a part of religious map is something traditional and common to Ukraine. But no one wants to come to Ukraine. And the moment when people will come to Ukraine and apply for asylum and be able to get it, if they deserve it, and integrate into Ukrainian society, that moment will mean that we are doing rather well as a country, that we are on the right track. As long as this is not the case, we do not see people trying to come to Ukraine, we do not see asylum system functioning, means something is probably wrong. That's about it. In short, it was not short, sorry.
Thank you so much. I think you brought up several really important things. One of them is really, I think, stands at the essence of this school of Abducted Europe, our understanding of what Europe is. I think there's this utopian image of Europe which is there in Ukrainian minds, and there is no certain understanding of what Europe is and what Europe brings and what kind of country are we building right now. Because you can see even from the way that we are trying to reform our country, there's just this message, we're doing European reforms. But what kind of European reforms? What kind of political system are we building? What kind of economy are we building? It's so different, and I think it's also part of this crisis as well. Whatever we're talking about, reforms, Europe, or this refugee crisis, it's there. It's this lack of understanding of what Europe is. So. It's I don't know, is it a question or a remark? If someone wants to answer to that, be my guest. But there's a second thing that is also interesting, and that I think it really lacks in any media, be it Ukrainian or European media. I think the conflict is inevitable. When you have so many people from other cultures coming into a country, you have to think, how do you integrate, how do you reintegrate them into your society? And there is and conflict is something that is inevitable. And my question would be, do you think that there is there a civilized discussion about that, or it's not a problem at all?
Do you mean, is there a civilized discussion about how to integrate people?
Yes.
I mean, there are in almost every European country that has immigrants, which is all of them really, except for the Eastern European countries. Although I should say there are 700,000 Ukrainians living in Poland now, and we don't call them refugees. We call them whatever, I don't know what we call them Ukrainians who live here. I mean, they don't have a special name even, and they seem to be fine. And everybody knows one, and everybody's met some, and so on. So Poland is capable of integrating people who are different. Of course, the main difference is that Ukrainians find it very easy to learn Polish, and when they walk down the street, they don't look different. So that's a major difference.
And they don't come at a certain moment in history.
No, they've been coming for the last decade, more in the last year and a half, more since 2014, but they've been coming for a long time. And they do integrate. But the question of how to integrate people has been a major political debate in Britain. It's a major political debate in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, and there are programs for immigrants. There are schools for immigrants. There have been a lot of big, a lot of major efforts have been made. I mean, I'm not going to say all of them have been good or successful or useful. And in fact, one of the arguments you hear in Britain, and I'm repeating the argument, not advocating it, that people say, and that people said in reaction to this latest crisis was, we spent all this time trying to integrate people, and yet we still have this problem of radical Islam here. And I would say no. In Britain and France, I would say 99% of immigrants do integrate. I mean, most people do integrate, and you see, there are Muslim members of parliament in Britain, and there's, the same in France, and they have shops and so on. But the few incidents of, there was a horrible incident a year or two ago where I think he was probably psychologically ill man cut off somebody's head in the street of London, and of course there are the famous incidents in Paris with the journalists. Every time there's an incident like that, people say, we've spent all this time, we've made all this effort, it hasn't worked. And so there is a sense, and I'm not saying it's legitimate, but there's a feeling that we can't, it's not possible, or we made lots of effort and it hasn't happened. And that's another thing that's underlying some of the debate. And it also underlies the resistance you saw in Central Europe, that we don't know how to do this. We don't know how to integrate people who are that different from us, and that's a piece of the problem. That's a piece of what bothers people about. I didn't think it's, as I said, I don't think it's entirely racism or xenophobia. Although I completely agree there is that too. That's definitely part of it. But there's also this sense that there is something about immigrants from Muslim countries, and that's a problem. And we thought we'd solved it, and we hadn't. And there continue to be these kinds of issues. And in a way, if you think how, there have been very few such incidents, but when they happen, they're very spectacular. As I said, 99% of people are not radical Muslims, but there are a few spectacular incidents. They cause a lot of anxiety. People focus attention on them. They're big media stories, and so they bother people more than that's a bigger story than the 99% of people who assimilate. Mm-hmm. So but yes, every country in Europe has some kind of assimilation program. The Dutch have these unbelievable schools and university courses, and there's a huge effort made, and there's a lot of, I think probably some countries do less well. I don't know how it works in Italy. I suspect not very well, but there are many countries that have made big efforts.
Mm-hmm. But if we're talking about those countries who will take more than, I think, 100,000 of refugees, and those are countries of Central Europe, do you think they will they be ready for this challenge, so to say, to integrate those people into their social life? Because from what we have seen now, it's just a plan to build another camp somewhere out of the city, and this is what will keep those people out of actually social life and create another ghetto.
There's another question here, and this is another problem, and this is another, unfortunately, correct, I think, criticism of the quota plan, is how are you going to keep people in Poland or Hungary or Slovakia? As somebody said in Poland, we're not going to build camps with barbed wire and tell people they can't leave. So there's another issue, which is will people want to go to countries that have no Muslims and have no tradition of integration and have no special programs and so on? So that's an impracticality that I actually haven't heard anybody explaining yet how it will be solved. I think the Poles have said they would take 10,000 people, which is not very many, but it's something. Mm-hmm. But how the 10,000 people will be persuaded to stay in Poland and not go to Sweden, I don't know. Nobody's explained that yet. There was, just after the Libyan revolution, the Poles did take a kind of several plane loads of, I don't know if you remember, but the Libyan revolution, there were a lot of Africans who'd worked in Gaddafi's Libya as servants and who were chased out of the country by the revolution. And the Poles took several plane loads of them to Warsaw. And the idea was that they would be as a sort of gesture to, and they got off the plane. They were very grateful. They were given some kind of housing. I'm sure nothing great. And within 3 months, they were all gone. They went to wherever. They went to Sweden or Austria or somewhere else. And so this is this quota idea sounds good and it sounds fair, and I'm in theory in favor of it, but there is an impracticality. How do you persuade people to stay in countries they don't want to stay in? Mm-hmm. But
Maksym, you want to?
Well, I completely agree that I wouldn't say conflict. I would rather use the word tension. That we face tension between peoples of different cultures. It just maybe to me it's a bit different because I took it from a different angle. Cultures are not just geographical and homogeneous inside themselves. We have different cultures in Ukrainian society, as we all know, and it's not only about territory, it's also different between urban and rural. It's at the end of the day between different areas in the city. To me, it always comes to my mind this quote from someone's article, who is an IT specialist and lived in Kyiv and then emigrated to the United States. And then he had to explain how comfortable he feels living in a neighborhood where 49% of population are white and 49 are black, and the rest is one person who is sick in turban and with beard. And he explained that he doesn't have problem with whites or blacks or with sick. But in Kyiv, he lived at Lisovy Massiv district, in Beaulieu, and he had culture clashes there with local inhabitants. He said, you probably understand what I mean by that. Of course, he had some culture problems and culture tensions between young hopniks and a middle-aged IT specialist who happened to live there. Integration is a huge problem, and it's interesting to map, when it comes to the EU, to map the integration systems where they are developed and where more and where they are developed less. Actually, for a person who wants to get to the European country which has proper integration system, let's say one of the North European countries, let's say Sweden or Norway, it looks like a horrible quest. First, a person has to find a way to the country neighboring the EU and to get through. Would it be Ukraine or Morocco or certain other countries from this defensive belt around the EU? Their border guard systems are enhanced by the EU grants and by the EU equipment and supported by the EU for years now. So the person has to get through, not staying there because it's uncomfortable. They don't have any integration systems, they don't have social support, and most of them don't have functioning asylum systems as such. Then to get into the EU but do not fall victim to Dublin agreements, because Dublin agreements is something most of refugees who were aware of them before arrival try to escape no matter what. If a person falls into Dublin agreement, they have to get stuck in Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Italy.
This is what Merkel did. She said, I don't care about the Dublin agreement.
Yeah, but Dublin agreements were subject of not criticism. Criticism would be the mild word for many people for years now. So to get through and then somehow to get to imaginary Sweden and apply for asylum there, trying to explain how this person managed to get on Swedish soil without stepping a foot on Polish or Hungarian or some other. And then this person finds a proper integration system. The more closer to the external borders of the EU, the more difficult it is to integrate. No system as such in many places, and no tradition of integration, and no understanding why it's needed. So it is discussed, but what we saw in many countries, especially now, discussion about integration is replaced with discussion about how to keep them away. Not only from integrating into society, but from being visible, and ideally from the territory of the country. In my very subjective opinion, what we see is a challenge to the very concept of the nation state, actually, in a way. Control over the territory and over the borders. And what I liked about quota ideas, not how it's shaped currently, but it's quite obvious to me that the current situation can be resolved in more or less human way, keeping humanitarian values, which are also at the foundation of the European institutions, not only economy and security. it's a cooperation between different countries. Without cooperation between different countries, there will be nothing. And currently we see that some states actually would like to be more nation states, more isolated and less cooperative. I'm afraid this is a doomed strategy. But also it concerns integration systems. Those who have them better developed probably should help those who just are developing them. There is an expertise in place and there are resources available, at least some, for them. It will be mutually helpful.
You want to say something? No?
No, it's okay.
No, I just wanted to add something to say that it brings us to this discussion out there of how the European Union might look like in several years from now with this crisis, and also to the question where is there a place for Ukraine actually in this in the European Union that might change the way it looks now right now. What do you think about this discussion, and how does it look right now from your perspective? Is it really a great challenge for the European Union as a union of states in the way it looks like right now?
I mean, sort of yes and no. I mean, the European Union actually has overcome a couple of worse crises, I think, in the last few years. I mean, I think the Greek debt crisis, in a way, was created even more pressure and was even more angst-filled than this one is. So it's not the first such crisis. But I think you were onto something when you said it's bringing to the foreground this issue of what it means to be a nation state and what it means to be part of Europe. And the people, as I said at the beginning, this issue, the refugee issue divides every European country, but this issue also divides every European country. And within every country, you can find people who will say, we've given away too much sovereignty. We're losing the sense of what it means to be Dutch. You can also find people who very much believe in this, we help the Italians out with immigrants, and, the Italians help us out when we're worried about Russia, the Baltic states, and, the British have, that there are people who understand the fundamental basis of this, of the union, and then there are people who don't, and the people who don't are almost everywhere. They're now politicized, and so and this is, I'm now repeating myself, but it's very important to understand, if you're a politician, if you're Merkel or if you're David Cameron, when you think about these issues, what you think about is the politics of it, and the politics of it are make easy resolutions difficult, because even if you could probably get together the majority of the leaders of Europe and you could come to an agreement about quotas and about sharing things and about swapping, but each one of those leaders would be then at risk of being challenged by, I don't know what the word for them is, the nationalists or the pro-sovereignty-ists, or the people inside their country, and those numbers of people are growing, and they're growing. For some reasons, I think that have nothing to do with Europe. I mean, I think they're growing as because of the sense of. People have in general a sense of loss of control over their own societies, and I think most of that is really more to do with globalization and the fact that whether China's stock market crash affects your stock market and therefore your pension plan, and your government and you have no means of controlling that, or I think this is what makes people insecure all over the world, and I think it's now beginning to affect Europe as well, and. The refugee crisis, I think in particular, this version of it, in which it suddenly looked like there could be a stream of, many millions, there were several million people in Syria who are displaced, and we can't control that. There's a sense of loss of control that people don't like, and this is strengthening that voice inside a lot of countries. And then there are politicians who find it useful to manipulate that and push it. So, we've had, and you saw this is what you saw in Slovakia, and actually you saw the Poland has an election right now, and the opposition party in Poland has no refugees. There's 0 right now. And it has no Muslims. There are none. Nevertheless, the opposition leader has made a great issue out of this, the threat of refugees and the threat of being overwhelmed and so on. And this is it's kind of code language for, it's a way of, stoking up people's fears. If we join these international communities, we'll lose something. We'll lose our sense of nation. And this is happening, you can see it in every country, but in the countries where it's been, manipulated for political reasons, it's getting stronger. And that, I think, is, and that's a danger. And that's also, for Ukraine, you have the misfortune of also being a very large country. And so in terms of letting in Ukraine, there would be different views of across Europe. In Poland, Ukrainians aren't even noticed as a foreign population. Nobody thinks they're different at all. But if the prospect of opening the border to Ukraine were to come up, you would hear people in France and people in Sweden and people in Austria, wherever, Spain, might say, well, these Ukrainians really Europeans like us? So you would hear that, but I'm not sure I wouldn't take it too personally. I think it's a function of other things that are going on right now. The sense people have of losing control over the border, over our money, over our economy. That's internationalization of everything. But that's an issue to deal with down the road. You agree with me? Disagree with me?
No, I'm afraid my crystal ball doesn't work in the last 2 years at least, so I leave it at home all of the time. I was really interested to hear what you say, and this is, I of course I agree that a lot of people support protest parties, whatever they are, right or left. Unfortunately, they're more to the far right, at least because they provide simpler answers. But the support comes in the first place for many people from my experience as a journalist and as someone who lived for several years in the UK, comes a lot from the feeling of powerlessness and losing control over one's own life. But coming back also to Angelina's question, I wanted to make one point. I think there is a very good side of Ukrainian European aspirations in terms of interest, and the longer, the deeper interest in the processes going on around in the EU. But I would warn against being too the EU-centristic, because when we talk about the refugee crisis now, everyone talks about the refugee crisis in Europe. The refugee crisis, real one, is in the Middle East. So when you compare figures of refugees from Syria who entered the EU countries and compare it to Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, you'll see a totally different picture, and the picture which is on the verge of a catastrophe. When you'll compare how many people live in Lebanon, and if I'm not mistaken, it's somewhere between 3 and 4 million.
Almost 1.5
million of refugees they've took in, and this is a real difference for them. It's not 300,000 or 400,000 or 600,000 refugees for the EU countries. Yeah, so I would just, I don't know, it's not always for me with myself, but I'm trying to enlarge the scope of what I look at when talking about these international processes. But also it has a political implications. Currently, the EU will not be able, as a single body or as a collective of states, will not be able to be so moderate when it comes to international policy in the Middle East. They probably will have to somehow more openly or publicly try to do something when it comes to open and prolonged armed conflicts ruining the whole societies.
I think there's an important thing I have to add with my little messy introduction. I think we should distinguish between the governments and the politicians and the civil society, because what we have seen, first of all, here in Ukraine and also in the countries which faced this refugee crisis as the first European countries to face it and at the front line, we have seen actually huge solidarity. What we've witnessed in Hungary, hundreds of volunteers just spending their days and nights at train stations and helping people to, get through this, buying them tickets, bringing food and water, advising them, taking them to the doctors. Of course, when we're talking about Hungary, it's always Orban there on the front page, but those people are somewhere in the shadow. But I think they are the faces of Hungary who actually made this whole story. They were the people whom the refugees met in the first place. Of course, first it was Hungarian police at the border, but then there was somebody to take them to a safe place and to help somehow. And there is still a huge movement, civil movement in Hungary, and those people are just doing a tremendous job. So I think it's very similar to Ukraine. When we were talking about Ukraine and Yanukovych being the face of Ukraine, we managed somehow to change this situation, and now when people are talking about Ukraine, it's more about the civil society of Ukraine. Of course, it's more about Maidan, which is still there, and I hope will stay there. So I think it was really important to add that.
When I meant to say this too, when I talked about every country being divided, obviously Hungary is divided too, and Poland is divided too. So there are for and against voices, but so be careful about, you're absolutely right, be careful about stereotyping people depending on who's in the government right now.
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's just we're out of no, we're not out of the discussion, but we would really like to hear your questions. So if you have some questions or remarks, you're welcome. Yes, please.
We don't have a second mic, so just stand up and shout.
I would like to have one remark and one question. The remark regards Ms. Merkel's stand-up, because I guess that we can either agree with what she did or disagree, but I don't think it's fair to blame on her breaking the major rules of the asylum system, because they have been broken for at least half a year, even if this wasn't really outspoken and he was the first one who actually did, but for months and months the Greeks, the Italians, and then the Hungarians as well completely overlooked the basic rules of the Dublin system. So I think we have to be a bit more fair with her. And then I would have a question which perhaps can bring us a bit closer to the very title of this meeting, namely the implications for Ukraine of the refugee crisis in Europe or in the world in general. And I would be really interested to hear your opinions on how you think this situation in Europe would influence the EU's policy towards Ukraine or towards the Eastern Partnership countries as such. Because you have already mentioned that perhaps on a society level in the EU countries there might be less welcoming attitude towards, for example, Ukrainians who come to work to the EU. But I'm wondering what direction the EU's policy, the Eastern Partnership, might take in the light of this crisis.
Thank you. Maxim or Anne, who would?
Well, I think I was trying to say it delicately, but I don't think it's good for Ukraine. The anxiety about borders and the anxiety about too many people coming in and so on. Although the EU accession process is a very, very long one anyway, so 10 years from now, when we're finally talking about, perhaps talking about Ukrainian accession to the EU, this crisis will be long behind us. So I think I don't think it's necessarily directly relevant. Right now we're at a moment when people are talking about closing the borders, and there's a lot of frantic feeling about, too many people coming in and we can't deal with it all, and so on. So this is not the best moment for to talk about Ukrainian accession, but since we're not talking about it anyway, it's just as well. But 10 years from now, it may be different. Looking into you said you didn't like crystal balls, but go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, I just agree. I don't see the opportunity or options of positive political implications. I was fairly surprised when one of the first big articles in Ukrainian media concerning outcomes for Ukraine of the refugee situation in Europe was totally focused on Schengen system. I don't see how Schengen area will be able to give up freedom of movement enjoyed on everyday level by nationals of these relevant countries. The other thing is that, of course, for Ukrainians who do not enjoy freedom of movement when it comes to the EU for years now, and unfortunately are rather used to quite humiliating and too strict, to put it mildly, a system when it comes to crossing the EU borders, I could probably say they will be even less free, but there are not many options of making it less free for Ukrainians anyway. What is really sad that if not Ukrainian internal situation in the first place, meaning war in the East and IDPs issue, which is quite new to Ukraine as a country, internally displaced persons, meaning from Crimea and the East. If not that, maybe there could be even some positive outcomes, for instance, for Ukrainian asylum system, because until recently the EU was rather criticized for securitizing and militarizing border systems of the neighboring countries and maybe overlooking the humanitarian aspect of it. But currently Ukraine and neighboring countries have their hands full with Ukrainian IDPs and Ukrainian refugees. So there is not much chance of getting any positive outcome from the current situation either. So to me it's neutral towards negative, rather, put it this way.
And I have something to add up. I think it's also create a massive field for political speculation. Even now, with no influx of refugees, we already hear some certain political parties putting a blame on refugees for breaking down or killing our European aspirations and killing our European perspectives. It's already out there. So sometimes it's really fearful to think what will happen next when we will really face this at certain moment. Yeah, there was a hand over there.
Hi, I was wondering if the countries of Central Europe took in many refugees from Chechnya in the 1990s, and if so, is there any institutional memory of that, and does that play any role in public debates about what it's like to deal with or handle Muslim refugees?
They did. I know they're in Poland, but I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I mean, I know that it was a sort of small enough number so that people felt comfortable. There was no protest and no opposition to it at all. I mean, I remember reading an article about Chechen kids in a Polish school learning Polish, and everybody was, people were quite friendly to them. And my son actually worked there's a refugee center outside of Warsaw, and he went and worked there one summer, and they were, most of the people his age, he was a teenager, were Chechens. So he played chess with them, I think, and they beat him, as I recall. But so there has been, the Chechens have been, I think the difference, there are two differences. One is that they arrived in, slowly, and they were in fairly small numbers, and it wasn't in the middle of a very, very bitter political campaign. I mean, I can't stress enough the importance of the politics of each country and the nature of the political debate in each country. Right now in Poland, the Polish opposition party has seized on this as a useful issue, and therefore it's an issue in Poland. Whereas I didn't think, 6 months ago, nobody was talking about it. I mean, it didn't have there wouldn't have been much resonance if you'd said to people, should we take some Syrians who've been lost their homes during the war? People might have said, oh yeah, that's a good idea, we should do that. I mean, that's my sort of general feeling. But it's been politicized the way that Orban politicized it, and the way others have tried to politicize it. Marine Le Pen has tried to, and others have tried to do it. But no, there is a tradition of taking positions, but the numbers are small, and it was a kind of dribbling in over several years rather than they didn't come 10,000 all at once. So.
Is there, in your opinion, or should there be any difference in the definition between economic immigrants and refugees?
You want to take that one first?
Okay, I'll take this one first, and then I feel somehow that you'll surprise me, because my take on that is rather traditional one, with few I don't know even the word for that in any language, with few remarks or few exceptions. On one hand, there is not much difference when it comes to me when it comes to people who have to move. There is this famous catchphrase, I think, of one of the founders of the Amnesty International, who said, death by hunger is not better than death by bullet. So people who have to flee somewhere looking for a job and sending money home to feed their families, they're considered to be economic migrants, while people who flee wars and open armed conflicts, they're considered to be refugees, not according to 1951 Refugee Convention, by the way. But those who flee political persecution or religious one, etc., they are refugees, obviously. But on the ground, when you look at people who have to move, maybe against their will, maybe they never actually dreamed of that, but there was a moment in their lives when they had to abandon what they had and move. On the ground, there is not much difference. On the other hand, to me, there is one extremely important difference, and this is a very traditional take on that. Refugees cannot go back. Economic migrants can. In most of cases, being deported from a country where someone stays illegally, I'm trying usually not to use this word, or stays legally but works legally, to be deported back to home country usually means to lose a lot of money, to find oneself in a very uncomfortable situation, but not more than that. But while a refugee is sent back to the country of origin, most of the time it means risk to life, risk to health, imprisonment, torture, and quite often death.
Can I ask then one question more? According to this last difference you are mentioning, coming back or not to your home place, why are media so generous in terms of course, like European are open for refugees and whatever? Why are media so egoistic when we are talking about immigrants, economic immigrants, if economic immigrants can return and refugees not? So that looks like a contradiction. In terms of sharing richness of a nation, for example.
I'm not sure I had it, but maybe you mean that economic migrants come to work and then to go back while refugees come to stay.
Yeah, but why are European policies so generous to refugees, and why are they so tight-fisted to immigrants if immigrants can always return?
I wouldn't say they're generous. I wouldn't call them generous, frankly. But on why European policies are this or that, I will be honest with you, I am not the one who designed them. I am not responsible for European policies, no.
I mean, I didn't design them either, stipulates it. But this is a historical difference. I mean, this is, there's a thing called being an asylum seeker, and there's a legal distinction between people who are refugees and people who are economic migrants. And to be qualified as an asylum seeker and to be qualified as a refugee, there's a sort of tests you have to pass. And there's a sort of legal, there's actually a legal distinction, and if you pass these certain tests and you can show that you were politically persecuted and you can't go home, then you qualify as being a political, as being qualifying for political asylum. And this, why is that? That sort of goes back into European history since the war, and the feeling people had after the war that I'm trying to think how to say this in 15 seconds, that, we had this terrible experience of political persecution, and we want to, extend our value, that experience to other people and so on. And I think, and it was a thing that worked very well for a long time when it was about small numbers of people. And then in the last decade or two, really having more to do with airplanes and transportation and the ease of getting to places, the numbers began to go up very dramatically, and there was a lot of pressure on the asylum system. I wrote about this in Britain, actually, I think even 15 years ago. There began to be, but I think, to return to your original question, I think for 90% of the time, the distinction between economic migrants and political refugees is completely artificial. I mean, I don't think, very many people, you can argue them either way. I mean, even some of the people coming from Syria, it's clear that they could stay in Syria, but it's very unpleasant to live in Syria when there might be a bomb falling on your house. So, so you're
it's more complicated.
Yes, or even more complicated. So, so many of the stories are incredibly complicated, and many of the stories of people who are clearly economic migrants can be equally moving and heartbreaking as the people who are coming from Syria. So, I think generally speaking, it's a false distinction, but it's got a very important legal status, and so people are treated legally very differently depending on which they qualify as, and that's why in a way it's one of these things I think that's used to lower the numbers. So people say, a lot of people have said in the last few weeks, okay, we'll take real political refugees but not economic migrants, and I think that's another way of saying we'll take fewer people. I mean, I think that's maybe sounds cynical, but I mean, I think in practice that's how it's used. But it's a legal distinction rather than a real one most of the time.
I just wanted to add that in reality, sometimes it's even more complicated, because when you have a guy from Syria who fled from Aleppo and stayed for the past 2 years in Turkey, gathering money to move out his whole family from Aleppo, and they are out there. But he didn't come actually from Aleppo. He came from Turkey, but he can't go back either to Turkey because he left his job, and he can't go back to Aleppo because it's destroyed. And he's the only English-speaking guy in his family, and he has a pregnant sister and a pregnant wife and his old mother. So practically speaking, he's an economic migrant because he already left Syria for Turkey. But in reality, he can't go back to his motherland, and he can't go back to Turkey because he cannot find job there as well. So it's sometimes it's really complicated.
I'm hoping you could address a little more this issue of Ukraine's own crisis with its IDPs, because I think this is a real important context that we're going to talk about the implications for Ukraine of the European refugee crisis. I mean, there's some very important distinctions here to be made between the refugees in Europe and the IDPs in Ukraine, but I think they both raise some similar questions regarding, say, integration of these populations into the population they've been displaced to, about European integration for Ukraine in this case, issues about xenophobia, discrimination in some cases, and about sort of challenges even to the nation state. So I'm wondering if or how you would even maybe draw these parallels, given the context.
Maksym?
Of course, there are a few parallels to be drawn, or not even to be drawn, which just seem to be quite obvious. When last summer, summer 2014, we witnessed in some segment of Ukrainian media, specifically in some regional ones, this rising tide of basically hate speech towards IDPs from Donetsk and Lugansk regions. These texts were very similar in their structure, in their approach to classical, typical migrantophobic, anti-immigrant or anti-refugee texts in many European countries. These people come to our land from Donetsk, for instance, to our, Черкащина, Ivano-Frankivsk, or Лесовый массив, wherever. These same people who say that, of course, they say that Donbass is Ukraine. But at the same time, they say from there, Donetsk, they come to our land. They don't speak our language in case of Ukrainian-speaking regions. They have different everyday customs. They're more prone to criminality. They take our jobs. At the same time, they are trying to use our benefits. They take places in kindergartens and schools. They overuse medical assistance. They do not perform their duties as citizens, but they demand more and more. You take this text and you do not know if it's in Ukraine regarding IDPs from Donetsk or Lugansk, if it's in France regarding immigrants from Maghreb, if it's in Hungary concerning recent wave of refugees. So the matrix is very typical. First is us and them. They come to our place doing contradictory things at the same time, like taking our jobs and not working but using our social benefits. And it's very typical. Then we saw this tide being stopped basically and turned around. So now, of course, Ukrainian media have from time to time these manifestations of openly xenophobic language towards IDPs, but it's rather an exception than everyday practice. And even more surprising against this background was the same discourse repeated in Ukrainian media concerning refugees from Syria in Serbia and Hungary. It was like a flashback from last summer. Of course, then issues of integration are extremely important, maybe even critical. Ukraine does not have, never had integration system for international refugees proper, for international refugees. And suddenly there is a need of having integration system in local receiving communities for IDPs. If I'm not mistaken, tomorrow we have 20th of October, right? So it will be 1 year since Ukrainian parliament voted the law on protection of rights of IDPs, the law which was fought hard for by Ukrainian NGOs and volunteers movement. And finally it was adopted, and it envisages integration system and social assistance, etc., and it does not work. So for the whole year, it mostly, in most parts, specifically in integration, it's void. And even more than that, unfortunately, we see that many people say it openly, some people say it rather more quietly, that the priority of the authorities currently is to not integrate IDPs into receiving communities, but to keep them in this undecisive state until they will be forced to go back. And this also draws certain parallels with treatment of immigrants, undesirable immigrants, would they be asylum seekers or not, in certain European countries. Unfortunately, structurally, these processes have many common points. But then, of course, 1.5 million of IDPs for Ukraine, for society's infrastructure, and for the coming years, maybe decades, is a huge challenge. And the strategy of avoiding integration from the side of the authorities, to me personally, looks irresponsible in the first place.
And now I'm going to make you feel better just by offering you a little historical comparison, which is that the East Germans who fled from East Germany to West Germany in the 40s after the war encountered exactly the same thing. Why are these people here? They're, why don't they go home? They're taking our jobs. And I mean, this is not a Ukrainian problem, yeah. But it was exactly the same, and it took them years to integrate, and they felt like, well, they were from, Dresden, and they just couldn't get on in the Rhineland, and so it was very similar, and that the difference, of course, when you're within a single country is that at least there's the language and there's, you don't have this problem of being a Hungarian who has to learn German, or so at least it's your language and your culture. At some level, it's your culture. So that's fundamentally makes some things easier.
But was there a huge political narrative there that we are the same country, we are united, we're welcoming them when they're moving around our country? Because there is nothing like that here in Ukraine, nothing like this. And this crisis is also handled only by the hands of the civil society as well. There is no strategy. There is no specific actions from the government as well. So this is why we don't feel so good.
I mean, Germany was in such crisis for for a decade after the war. I think there was probably, depending on who was in charge at what time, there was, in theory, we welcomed them. And then as the Cold War kicked in, there was more, people began to understand better what life was like in East Germany, and there was more welcome for them. And then over time, more. But I think at the very beginning, it was pretty chaotic. And I think to the extent that they were helped at all, it was by their mostly relatives and we didn't call them NGOs in the 1940s, whatever they were, charities.
So we have time for probably one more question if anyone has one. Yes, please go ahead.
I wanted to ask about LGBT asylum seekers. Do you include them in LGBT asylum seekers? Do you include them when you talk about refugee crisis we had?
I can't hear. I'm sorry. LGBT. Are we including LGBT people when we're talking about asylum seekers? I think they are legally there if they're seeking political asylum. For example, if they're coming from Iran, where there's a death penalty, of course they are asylum seekers. And actually, one of my colleagues met an Iranian guy who was fleeing Iran for this specific reason. He was heading to Germany.
Well, most of at least European countries have asylum legislation based on the principles of 1951 Convention and Refugee Convention and the 1967 protocol to it. And it provides, if I'm not mistaken, 5 criteria who can be recognized as a refugee. Well, in the first place, the person should be outside of the country of origin, not being able to return to it due to well-grounded fear of persecution on certain grounds, and these 5 grounds are quite clear. It's political views, religious beliefs, nationality, something else can be mistaken, and allegiance to certain social group. Because of course it's not possible to list all the varieties of belonging criteria all over the world. So allegiance to or belonging to certain social group is exactly what you ask about. Being a member of LGBT community for most of countries who have asylum systems is that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, yes.
All right. Thank you very much to the 3 of you for joining us. Anne will be appearing at America House both tomorrow and Wednesday. So if you want to hear more, speaking about nationalism tomorrow and then information wars on Wednesday, I believe. And here tomorrow night, we have 2 lectures awaiting us. Katha Pollitt will be speaking about women's rights in America. And then Stephen Lukes will be speaking about the idea of progress and social democracy. So please join us beginning at 6. From 6 until 9, we'll be here again tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining us.